Alright, this is going to be your Unit 20 video lesson, Part 1 and Part 2. I'm going to discuss both of those topics covered in both parts in this one video instead of dividing it into two like I originally planned. This is going to cover topics of levels of organization and energy flow. And that way you will have more time to get your interactive notebooking activities completed and turned in. So make sure you are writing everything down that you see on the screen, everything that I have typed on the screen, as well as anything extra that I'm adding to the notes in your journal, and make sure you get that checked off when you have it complete. Alright, so here we go. Alright, the first thing we're going to discuss is levels of organization. So everything around us in our world is organized into levels, from smallest to largest. So our smallest level is going to be the atom. So the smallest level of anything is the atom. From the atom, we put different atoms together to build molecules, like putting a hydrogen and oxygen together to get a water molecule. We put water molecules to build organelles, which are parts of cells. So we put molecules together to build up organelles. We put organelles together to build up cells. Okay. We put cells together to build tissues. We put tissue together to build an organ. Right? We put organs together to build an organ system. We put an organ systems together to build an organism. We put a whole bunch of the same type of organisms together to make a population. Populations of different types of organisms that live together make up a community. Communities together make up an ecosystem. Ecosystem includes the living and the non-living parts of the community of the environment. Ecosystems together make up biomes. And the different biomes make up the biosphere or the earth. So over here, atom is our smallest part, smallest level of organization. Biosphere would be our largest level of organization. Cells, remember this is the smallest unit of life. So make those notes down. Make sure you have this written either linearly, or as I have written it on the screen. We're going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. So for our ecology unit, we're going to be focusing more on things bigger than an organism. Okay, so we've spent all of last semester, mostly up until this point, talking about things on a microscopic level. You know, biomolecules, cells, different types of molecules within a cell, like DNA and things like that. So now we're going to be talking about things that are bigger than an organism. So if we started an organism, we know that organisms that are the same make up a population. So the question here says, what's the difference between a population and a community? Well, a population equals like organisms. So this would be like the number of deer living in a forest. Okay, that would be a population of deer. We're only talking about the number of one type of organism. Okay, a community, this is going to equal many populations together. So for instance, community might be the deer along with the birds and the trees. The population, those populations together would be considered a community. Okay, so populations and community, these are considered to be these only have what we call abiotic, biotic factors. Okay, if it's biotic means living. So these include only the living things in an environment. Population is only one type of organism. Community are all of the living organisms together would equal a community. So when we get to talking about abiotic and biotic factors together, this is going to be called an ecosystem. So this is going to be the biotic and abiotic, okay, factors together. So biotic means living. Abiotic, this is going to mean non-living. So when we talk about an ecosystem, we might be talking about not only the deer, the birds, and the trees, but also the rocks and the river and all those non-living things that also are present in the environment. All of those things together would equal the ecosystem. Right, so now that we've talked about how things are organized within our environment, let's talk about how energy flows through an ecosystem. Right, so we should know a couple of these terms already, but I'm just going to refresh your memory. So you should write these down as well. An autotroph, remember, is an organism that makes its own food. Okay, so when we think of autotrophs, most of us think of plants because plants are what we call photoautotrophs. So photoautotrophs use photosynthesis, which we just finished discussing. So these are going to be like our plants, and some single-celled organisms are also able to do photosynthesis. But mostly think of plants. They're using light to make food through photosynthesis. Chemoautotrophs are also going to be able to make their own food, but instead of using light as an energy source, they're going to use chemicals from the environment to be able to make their own food. So both are still autotrophs, making their own food. They're just using different energy sources to do so. Right, heterotrophs are like you and me, when they have to consume other organisms in order to get energy. Okay, so they're not capable of making their own food. Some subcategories of heterotrophs would be like decomposers. These are going to break down dead matter and return the nutrients back to the soil. This can be like your fungi and bacteria that live in the soil, in the environment. The detritivores, these are going to feed on dead and decaying organisms. Basically, this is going to be like shrimp, things like at the bottom of the food chain. They're just going to be eating dead things. Scavengers are going to be eating leftovers from predators. So a predator comes and kills something, and then scavengers are going to come and eat at whatever the predator's left behind. Okay, so those are subcategories of heterotrophs. Alright, so when we talk about energy flow through an ecosystem, it's important that we discuss our energy pyramid. We're only going to go up to 4 levels, and you should probably recognize this as something that you've seen or learned before. We know that at the bottom of our pyramid, we have to have our largest group, which is going to be our producers. No, let's write this at the top. You need to draw this pyramid as well in your journal. So these are going to be our producers. Producers are going to be autotrophs. Okay, so these are going to be making the food for everyone else. So producers are at the bottom of our energy pyramid. They get 100% of the energy. And we're going to talk about, sometimes producers aren't always plants. Sometimes they are single-celled organisms like phytoplankton in a marine food chain, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Above producers, the organisms that consume producers are called primary consumers. And your primary consumers are going to be your herbivores. Herbivore means it's eating only plants, things that are not meat. So primary consumers are going to be your herbivores. The organisms that eat primary consumers are called secondary consumers. And these are more likely than not going to be your omnivores, meaning that they eat both plants and animals. So we are going to fall mostly into the secondary consumer category. At the very top of our pyramid, this is our tertiary consumer. Tertiary consumers feed on secondary consumers, and these are going to be your carnivores. So these are only our meat eaters at the top of our pyramid. Okay, so producers at the bottom, they get 100% of the energy available to them, okay? Where is this energy coming from? Energy is coming from the sun. Okay, so our sun is our main source of energy for everything that's living on Earth. So producers have 100% of the energy available from the sun. Okay, now between each trophic level, each of these levels is called a trophic level. Between each trophic level, only 10% of energy can be passed on, which means our primary consumers are only going to have 10% of the original energy that's provided by the sun. And then from our primary consumers to our secondary consumers, only 10% of that's passed on. So now we have so now we just have 1%. 1%. So we do 10% of 10 would be 1%. So now secondary consumers only have 1% of total energy available. And then when we go to our tertiary consumers, again, only 10% is passed up here. So now we have 0.1% is available at the very top to our carnivores. So as we move up our energy pyramid, we're going to see that the amount of energy available decreases. We should also see that because of this, the sizes of these populations are going to get smaller and smaller. So in an ecosystem, in order for it to be balanced, we need to have a large number of producers to be able to support everything after that. If our producers is too small, there will not be enough energy available to be passed on up our energy pyramid through each trophic level. Okay, so let's talk about what this looks like when we look at the different graphics that we use to help describe what's going on here. So when we're talking about energy flow through a ecosystem, we're going to have two different ways to describe what's going on, either through a food chain or a food web. So a food chain is just a linear model of energy flow. Okay, so this is going to be in a straight line. We're only showing one possible outcome. So it shows one possible outcome. Okay, food chains are good. They're simple, they're easy to read, but they're not always the best because they're not going to be as comprehensive as a food web. A food web is going to show all possible energy flow relationships in an ecosystem. Okay, so and this is going to be more accurate to what's actually occurring in nature. In nature, we're not just going to have, we don't just eat one thing only. We're going to be eating whatever food is available to us. And so food webs are able to show us the vast variety of those types of relationships that we can observe in nature. Okay, so let's look at this aquatic food chain that I have here. I've included an aquatic food chain because this is not one that gets discussed very often or that we think about because we are terrestrial beings. We live on the land, and so when we think of how energy flows through an ecosystem, we automatically think about how, what eats what and on land and different types of ecological relationships between land animals. We often neglect to think about what's going on in our aquatic environments around us as well. So notice that when we're drawing a food chain or a food web, our arrows are going in the direction of energy flow. So that means it's like we're putting this organism into the mouth of the organism that's coming after it. Okay, so it is showing the direction of energy flow. This may not always be pointing up. This could be pointing down. Sometimes on tests and things like that, they like to be tricky. So just make sure it's always pointing in the direction of the energy flow on who is consuming who. So in this aquatic food chain, we have our different 4 trophic levels shown. Our phytoplankton here is going to be our producer. at the bottom of our food chain that's going to be producing and supporting the rest of everything else that's falling behind it. So we're going to have a large population of producers, a large population of phytoplankton. The phytoplankton is going to be consumed by our primary consumer, which is the zooplankton. And our zooplankton then is going to be consumed by the small fish. So our small fish would then be our secondary consumer. Notice that as we go up the chain, our populations are getting smaller and smaller at each trophic level. This is again because not as much energy is available. Remember, to be only 10% of the energy is passed on from before. And then our small fish is going to be consumed then by a large fish, so that makes our large fish our tertiary consumer. Okay, so this would be a simple food chain in an aquatic environment, and I feel like you could probably do the same thing very easily with a terrestrial food chain. So let's take a closer look at a food web now. So here is a food web. Notice that a food web, we still have arrows. Arrows are still supposed to be pointing in the direction of the energy flow. So from the consumed to the consumer. And but you see here that we have more than one relationship shown. So a food web is showing all possible relationships in an ecosystem. So let's look here. I'm going to, if you want, I want you to draw this out. You don't have to draw the pictures, but I want you to write down the names of the different things in your journal so you can have an example as we label this. You will be having to label food webs and food chains by yourself on your interactive notebooking as well as on your assessment. So if we look here, I see two producers in our food web, and that's going to be our marsh grass and our cattails. These are our producers. We know they're producers because there is no arrow coming to them. They are at the bottom of our food web. So they are getting the energy from the sun. They are bringing that energy into our ecosystem. We see now. I'm going to use a different color. I'm going to use blue, and I'm going to circle our primary consumers. Remember, primary consumers are also our herbivores. So our grasshopper and our cricket. Those are the only two that are eating just the grass. Or the cattails, so they are going to be considered to be our primary consumers. From here, we can easily identify our secondary consumers. So our secondary consumers would be our shrew, as well as the frog, because the frog is eating the cricket, and the shrew is eating both the cricket and the grasshopper. And so these are going to be our secondary consumers here. Next, we have our tertiary consumer, and we can see here that the snake is eating the frog. So our snake would be our tertiary consumer. Our hawk is actually going to be a little tricky because we know our snake is a tertiary consumer, and we see here that our hawk is eating the snake, but it's also eating down here. It's also eating one of our secondary consumers. So our shrew is a secondary consumer. So our hawk actually is going to be what we call a quaternary consumer. And this just means that it's the fourth level, okay, so above a tertiary consumer because it's eating a tertiary consumer. So our hawk would be a quaternary consumer because it's consuming a tertiary consumer because of the snake. So hopefully this was easy for you to identify. Should have been a quick refresher for you. I will expect that you will be able to identify producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, as well as omnivores, herbivores, carnivores, and things like that on an assessment. So if we look at this, we can see that our grasshoppers and our cricket, since they are only eating the grasses of the producers, These are our herbivores. Our shrew and our frog, these are going to be omnivores because they are secondary consumers. The shrew could also eat the grass. We just aren't showing that arrow. They've neglected to leave that one off. And our tertiary consumer is going to be a carnivore, as well as our quaternary consumer. So that'll be a carnivore as well. All right, so this will be the end of our video. I hope that this was a good refresher over energy flow and levels of organization within the world around us. Make sure you have everything written down and recorded in your journal. Go ahead and make sure you get it checked off when you are finished. And you should begin working on the levels of organization interactive notebooking assignment and the abiotic versus biotic interactive notebooking assignment as well.